It only took us a month to get through chapter 1, so we're doing great. And so if you want to turn to John chapter 2, we're going to be looking specifically at verses 1 through 12. And if you were taking notes this morning, the title is Heaven is Open. And that is continuing what Jesus has already said in verse 51 of chapter 1. Then he said, "Truly I tell you, you'll see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And so the story moves along, and John, the author of the fourth gospel, is continuing to tell us about the life of Jesus. And so we read in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding as well. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him, "They don't have any wine." "What has this concern of yours to do with me, woman?" Jesus asked. "My hour has not yet come." "Do whatever he tells you," his mother told the servants. Now 6 stone water jars had been set there for Jewish purification. Each contained 20 or 30 gallons. "Fill the jars with water," Jesus told them. So they filled them to the brim. Then he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the head waiter," and they did. When the head waiter tasted the water after it had become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. He called the groom and told him, "Everyone sets out the fine wine first. Then after people are drunk, the inferior. But you have kept the fine wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days. You may or may not be familiar with this story. You may or may not know that this is Jesus' first miracle. All of that is true, and yet as we continue to process what is the author of the fourth gospel, John, wanting to convey, even though this story may be familiar, the meaning is very, very large and deep and reflects upon the life of Jesus. So we're going to get right into it. Verse 1, it says, "On the third day." Now, those of you that enjoy timelines and like to kind of keep track of the days of the week and all that kind of stuff, you may be asking yourself, well, what does this mean and what day is this? And going back to last week, if you know, you know. And if you don't know, you don't know. And you're like, well, how do we find out? And here's what on the third day is referring to. The third day cannot refer to the day of the week in which the wedding occurred. And you might be saying to yourself, well, why is that? Well, if you know, you know, because according to Palestinian wedding customs, virgins were married on the 4th day of the week and widows on the 5th. So if you just know that rule, then you know that, well, that's not happening. It's not happening on the third day, because if that took place, then it would happen on a different day. And you're like, Chad, this doesn't make any sense. Well, that's okay. It also doesn't follow the timeline from chapter 1. If you're kind of keeping pace with how John is saying, okay, this day happened, and then the next day, and then we went to this day, and if you're trying to keep track of that, if you go back to John chapter 1, verse 29, John says, the next day, John the Baptist saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." If you followed that timeline, this would make the third day in chapter 2 the 6th day. So it's not the third day either. So what's happening? So why the third day? Well, there's a couple of things to understand. When dealing with short periods of time, we do this all the time in our culture. We say the other day. The other day could be yesterday. The other day could literally be 6 months ago. We say the other day all kinds of times, and we don't even know what day we're talking about when we say the other day. Well, in their culture, when dealing with short periods of time, a third day, that expression was common. Now, on one level, John is simply allowing for the passage of time from the most recent event that has taken place in the story. And so it's a biblical idiom for the day after tomorrow. Now, that's something just kind of understand as John is moving through the story. But on another level, John is being highly intentional in the clues that he's giving throughout the narrative to identify the characteristics and the person of Jesus. So as you start to think about what meaning does the third day have, well, there's theological significance to the meaning of on the third day. We know this as people who live after the resurrection of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus on the third day. In fact, chapter 2, verse 19, as we move into next week's part of the narrative, Jesus answers, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." You see, all of chapter 2 is linked to a much bigger picture. John, as the author, is trying to get us as the reader and his original audience to understand the depth of what he's trying to convey in the second chapter of his gospel. The sign, or this water into wine, which we'll get into this morning, points to the ultimate sign of the resurrection. There's connection. There's connection between the water turns into wine and the resurrection. And then as we move into next week's story, Jesus' clearing of the temple also must be read in light of something that takes place in the story this morning, which is the ceremonial pots. It's all connected. The ceremonial pots are connected to the cleansing of the temple, and the wine is connected to the resurrection. All of this is going to come at a great price. These signs move Jesus closer. And we're going to, again, get into this. To the hour, like put a little asterisk there, the hour of his death. This is what John is getting at. So when he says the third day, he's moving us into a space of foreshadowing. And so just keep that in mind. Sometimes days are given to move the chronology, but other times it's given to express an idea, and you see that happening within the story. We're told that what's taking place is taking place in Cana of Galilee, which is about 9 miles north of Nazareth in Cana. Just again as a reminder, Nathanael is from Cana. Remember the little regional village rivalry that's happening? Nothing good can come out of Nazareth because Nathanael is from Cana. There's a good chance that Nathanael is somehow connected because he's from the same area. He's from Cana to the family that's throwing the wedding. So there's a connection there. We'll get into some wedding customs in a second. So the reason that Jesus may be attending the wedding may have to do with the connection of Nathanael. And then John is getting even deeper into what's going on regionally. And as you learn and grow in the story and the movement of Jesus, this is what you learn throughout the gospel. That Galilee has a positive reception of Jesus. Every time Jesus is around Galilee, things seem to be up and up. But Judea overall rejects Jesus. And you're going to see that happen. And so as Jesus moves through the region, there are areas that accept him, and there are areas that reject him. So we have Nazareth, we have Cana, and then later in the story at the end, we end up in Capernaum. And Capernaum is the place that Jesus lived when not traveling. It's where he, home base, if you will. And that's where people knew, where is Jesus? Oh, he's probably in Capernaum. So that's just another opportunity to understand the movement of Jesus. And more than likely, the place that Jesus stayed in Capernaum was Peter's house. So again, this is just putting people and places and things and situations into the context. We have to talk about weddings. Weddings are fun. Angel and I have had the opportunity to be part of, so many weddings. I recently did a brief count of through my pastoral life, and I've probably done about 50 weddings, so quite a bit. I enjoy weddings for the most part. There's some parts that I don't enjoy, but for the most part, I enjoy them. And as you think about weddings, every culture has practices in how weddings go and what takes place, and it is no different when you look at first century Palestinian wedding culture. So let's talk about this just a bit. And you'll notice even some of our traditions are carried over from ancient practices of wedding. The first, I think, is one of those examples. Wedding feasts were regarded as a necessary part of a legitimate marriage. I mean, have you gotten married unless you have really good food? I mean, that's kind of the connection, right? And so this is what's happening in this context. A feast is going to take place, and the feast is a celebration of the wedding. In fact, Jewish weddings emphasize joyous celebrations, including music. So it's a time of joy. It's a time of lots of music. It's a time of lots of good food. Now, this is where we differentiate a bit. Typically, weddings in the first century lasted 7 days, and guests would stay the entire length of time. Plan that for your guests. We think weddings are expensive now. So think about an entire week, and in some cases, the guests would arrive at different days, but the host had to plan for the guests for an entire week. And even this concession was made when it was going to be a time of celebration. The Jewish people saw it that it was okay, even the Pharisees, that study could be put on hold for the purpose of celebration. So you could even kind of stop and pause your normal, quote-unquote, spiritual routines in order to engage in the celebration of a wedding. If you were wealthy, you literally would invite the entire village to the wedding. And depending then on what your income bracket was, depended on how wide your circle was to invite. But they were big deals, huge deals. And so in verse 2, we are told that Jesus and his disciples are invited to the wedding as well. An invitation is made. And again, we can speculate as to what is the connection? Is the connection because Mary, the mother of Jesus, has lived in Nazareth, and so the family knows her? Maybe. Is it a connection because Nathanael lives in Cana, and the married couple is from Cana? Maybe. Could it be that the host is spreading wide their influence, and there's a well-known teacher in the area, which they often would invite well-known teachers to weddings, and Jesus is starting to pick up a bit of a reputation in the area? Could it be that they invited him? We're not exactly sure, but we know that Jesus shows up, and he shows up including himself with a total of 5. At this point, John has told us that it's Andrew, himself, Peter, Philip, Nathanael, and Jesus. So that's what you're looking at. 6 people. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6. A total of 6, including Jesus. So 5 followers and Jesus. This is who has shown up. Verse 3. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother told him they don't have any wine. All right, let's talk about wine for a bit, because why not? This is what the wedding is all about. Depending on your background, depending on the church in which you grew up in, depending on your view of all sorts of things, let's get once and for all the facts straight concerning the wine in Scripture. Here it is. It was not simply unfermented grape juice. Wine in Scripture, before, and this is a funny word, hermetic sealing, if you know what that means, that's just canning, airtight. Before the process of being able to suck the air out of something to preserve it, so before that, and before refrigeration, it was almost impossible to prevent fermentation, especially if you were going to keep anything for any length of time. So wine, 100% was fermented. At the same time, the alcoholic content of wine was not artificially increased through distillation, and people in the ancient Mediterranean world always mixed water with the wine when they served it with meals. And so when they mixed it, it would be 2 to 4 parts water per every part of wine. Undiluted wine in the first century was considered dangerous, and Judaism viewed drunkenness very unfavorably, as well as the Greeks and Romans traditionally also pointed to the negative moral effects of drunkenness. So they would point out that you would lose control, and there are all kinds of stories in Roman and Greek culture that great men would lose battles because they were drunk. And so drunkenness was still viewed poorly among all cultures. Wine was a normal part of daily life in the ancient Mediterranean world. Wine production was one of Galilee's primary industries. So we're in wine country in the ancient first century Palestine. This is what's happening here, with 7 or more Galilean cities and villages heavily engaged in the production of wine. So context and region and where are people getting their livelihood and what's happening in this space, all of this is right with the concept of the story of what is happening at this wedding. Now, what's the big deal? Guests are enjoying themselves. A party has been going on for some time. It can last up to a week. But what happens when the wine runs out? This was, and there's no way to express this was a social disaster. A complete disgrace for anyone hosting a wedding feast. This cannot be overstated. If you ran out of wine, it was a catastrophe. And there's not really a comparison. I mean, in my personal opinion, if you don't have good cake at a wedding, that's a catastrophe. But, to each his own. And so this is a cultural reality. In fact, the social tremors would have lasted for years, covering the family responsible in the running out of wine in shame. It would have put a shadow over the married couple, and it would have hung over their heads throughout their life together. Like, this is how big a deal this is. Again, there's no comparison. There's no way how to emphasize this more. We just have to understand and accept the reality of the situation. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is aware that the host has run out of wine. There's all kinds of social dynamics happening here. I'm not going to get into it. Often the women would know things are up before the men did. That's usually true now too. So that's just the way it is. And so Mary is closer to knowing what's going on, and she wants to do something about it. Jesus' mother, it's told to us in verses 3 through 5, approaches Jesus and says they don't have any wine. Now, when you read this in English and you read it in the CSB and you read it in most translations, it just doesn't do it well. It doesn't sit well with how Jesus responds to her, but this is how Jesus responds to her in a cultural context. Jesus says this, "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Not, "Why do you involve me, woman?" That's not the context. "Dear woman, why are you involving me?" This is how Jesus is responding to his mom. There is not one single hint of annoyance. Jesus is not annoyed at all. And if we read annoyance in the text, we are reading it incorrectly. Jesus is socially and culturally and relationally and familially responding to Mary correctly. All of that is happening here. And in fact, the only other time that you see this interaction happen is when Jesus is actually on the cross. And in chapter 19, verse 26 of John, he also speaks to his mother. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple he loved, speaking of John, the author of the fourth gospel, standing there, he said to his mother, as Jesus is dying to care for his mother, Jesus says, "Woman, here is your son." Now, if you connect 1926 with Jesus' response to, "Dear woman, why are you involving me?" It's nothing but love and respect. There's no annoyance whatsoever. So we got to get that clear in what's going on. And then this is what Jesus says to Mary. Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come. There's a clue there. Something is happening here. Why is that Jesus' response? Why is John, some 60 years later, highlighting how Jesus responds to his mother? Now, there were many things that Mary, the mother of Jesus, knew and understood about her son. I can't speak from the perspective of a mother, but I can speak from the perspective of a father who watches a mother's dynamic with her son. There are things that Angel simply knows about Kyle because Angel is Kyle's mother. And that's just how it is. That's the way things go. I also know growing up in a single parent home, it was just me and my mom, that we had a really good relationship growing up. There's just something beautiful about the relationship between a mother and a son. And so there are deep things that Mary would have known about Jesus. And we could even impact that even more based on the very significant circumstances of Jesus' birth. I mean, it wasn't a normal pregnancy, if you will. And so if you think about the relationship that Mary has with Jesus, she knows some things. And yet there are many things at this point in Mary's understanding of who Jesus is that she does not know. And we have to allow ourselves to be in that space of tension. You see, John is 100% most certainly highlighting something about Mary. He's highlighting her boldness. He's highlighting her charisma. And he's doing that to highlight her willingness to solve a problem, her intentionality in the story. And we'll come back to that in a second. But some questions rise to the surface in this interaction between Jesus and his mother. How exactly is Mary approaching Jesus? Is she approaching him as her son? Is she approaching him as a miracle worker? How is Jesus replying to Mary? Does he reply to her as her son? Or is he replying to Mary as her Lord? There's a lot going on in this recorded exchange. If we look to Augustine, he pondered the layers of the relationship between Mary and Jesus, and this is what he suggested. She had to learn that her relationship to Jesus as disciple was more important than her relationship to him as mother. I don't know if you've thought about the layers of Mary, but right here, the first miracle of Jesus, Mary, the mother of Jesus, who's no foreigner, if you will, to the miraculous, is in a space that is dealing with the depth of what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, and how is this playing out in the beginning of Jesus' ministry? Jesus took care of Mary both physically and spiritually. Ultimately, Jesus is Mary's Savior. And as you think through this, that role of Savior throughout Jesus' life had to take precedence over his role as son. Again, think about that dynamic. Both were true, and Jesus cared for his mother as a son would, but he also cared for Mary as the Son of God. And what is the dynamic of that, and how do you see the beauty of that relationship? You see, at the end of the day, as we mentioned last week, you don't know what you don't know. And Mary could not have known, she did not know, and would not have understood that this sign that she just asked Jesus to take care of would cost him. You see, this is the starting line. The reason Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come," is because this is the starting line to his hour. Well, what is that? His hour of his journey to the cross. This is the first miracle. the beginning of Jesus' signs, the start of Jesus' public ministry. And the end will be what? Jesus' final hour. This is the intent of the author of John. This is what Jesus is saying. Dear woman, my hour has not yet come. And if this is where we are headed, the time starts now. I want you to grab a hold of that. The time starts now. The hour, John has unveiled the plot of his whole narrative. Jesus is going to die. And this is a common technique of ancient writers. Foreshadowing in order to shape how the plot will be resolved. There's a lot happening as John is talking about this story. The hour toward which everything moves is the hour of Jesus' glorification. And in this moment, Jesus has his eye on the prize, if you will. Jesus is focused on the reality of his presence on this earth, and what every word and every step and every action and every interaction and every miracle and every sign, what all of those things are going to point to is ultimately going to do and accomplish the will of his Father who sent him to accomplish that very will. And we see it happening right here in real time. Mary's response to this interaction is a response that seems odd, but it is a response of deep, deep faith. And what does Mary say? Do whatever he tells you. Just do what Jesus tells you. Verse 6. Now 6 stone water jars had been set there for Jewish purification. Each contained 20 or 30 gallons. I want you to just take in this. Stone water jars are set aside, and John tells us these are set aside for Jewish purification. But there's something deeper going on here. And what's going on here, especially as you combine it with the second half of chapter 2, which we won't get into today, we'll get into next week, is that what John is starting to unfold in telling the story of the wedding is there is going to be institutional authority that's going to be challenged. Jewish purification and institutional authority. One example of institutional authority being challenged has already happened, and it's Mary's boldness and charisma in the situation. Already, Mary's initiative is challenging the institution. You've already seen it happen, but that's just going to be unfolded more and more and more. So one example is Mary's boldness and faith, but the other example is Jesus' lack of attachment to religious tradition. You see, Jesus could have performed his miracle in so many different ways. He could have said, "Bring me all of the empty wine vessels that have already been used." But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't say, "Hey, bring me the cases of empty fill in the blank." He says, "Bring me the jars that have been set aside for purification within the Judaism system. Bring those to me." So Jesus knows what he's doing. He is showing that he's not attached to religious tradition. You see, water is going to be changed into wine using jars that have been set aside for purification purposes. We have a battle of clean and unclean. You see, Jesus is intentionally creating a clash of values as the story is playing out. The water pots represent the provisions of the old covenant. The provision of abundant wine represents the blessing of the kingdom. There's comparing and contrast happening here. What does the water pots, what do they represent? They represent how the old took shape. But remember, a theme of John's gospel is the new, and so something's happening. There's a provision of wine, but not just wine, abundant wine, which is going to represent the blessing of the kingdom. And so abundance starts to be a pretty major theme. Abundance in association with Jesus. And you can go back to Genesis chapter 41, verse 55. You can start to see some connections. When the whole land of Egypt was stricken with famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh told all of Egypt, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. The same phrase that Pharaoh tells a community that is stricken with famine to go to Joseph, the person whom God had set aside to provide for his people. Do whatever Joseph tells you. And here we have something else happening. Jesus, like Joseph, will provide abundance in a time of need. Again, new things are coming. The ritual pots are now used for a new purpose. And later, as we get more and more and more in the story that John is telling, we're going to see a Samaritan woman, chapter 4, verse 28, leave her water pot behind because she discovers living water. You see, remember, part of John's intended audience is the Johannine community in Ephesus. And despite the accusations that Jesus is a heretic and that he has set aside Judaism, that the Jesus movement is antithetical to Judaism, this is not the attitude of Jesus. This is not the attitude of John as the writer of the fourth gospel. Followers of Jesus see Christ as an eschatological renewal of Judaism. It's an extension. This is what God has been doing from the beginning. Even though the leadership of Jerusalem is rejecting Jesus, Jesus has come to what? Not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. It's all connected, and there's big clashing happening. And Jesus knows what he's doing. His first sign sets up the clash at the very beginning. Jesus knows people are going to be talking about the tension that is caused between wine and purification vessels. Verses 7 through 10. Jesus says, fill the jars with water. I won't get into the math here, but if the jars, there's 6 of them, and they're already filled with 20 or 30 gallons, then Jesus, and that means they're only about half full or so, then Jesus says, continue to fill them with water. So now you have to double that, and then times it by 6. This is a lot of wine. Like, a lot of wine. So I just want you to capture the massive amounts that is taking shape here. Jesus told them, fill it with water, so they filled it to the brim. Then he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the head waiter. And they did. We're now in the middle of the miracle, and signs here is a glimpse of what Jesus told his followers would happen. This is the first sign. John points it out as the first sign. And Jesus has already said, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. The transforming power of Jesus is going to be displayed in the presence of a physical earth. Something is happening. The miraculous is engaging in the physical. Heaven is open. But I want you to notice something here. I want you to take the perspective of the servants who are listening to Jesus' instruction, and they start to carry the water or the wine to the head waiter. Now, we've had this discussion before at the feeding of the 5,000. Like when you have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus throws up a prayer to God and says, thank you, and there's 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then he breaks them apart, and the disciples are looking at him and going, okay, where's the miracle? Like, what is happening? What is required? Mary has already showed us what is required. Faith. And now the servants, notice, I think this is so intentional. The servants fill the vessels with water. Then they dip in. Then they start to take, it doesn't say what. They just start to take it to the head waiter. Read that again, over and over again. I've read this so many times. Fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the head waiter. Now the text doesn't tell us, but what did they draw out? I don't know. It doesn't say. Did they draw out water? Did they draw out wine? Did they draw out something else? Like it doesn't say, but my gut tells me the way faith works is the servants are like, okay, we took the jugs. Okay, we filled it with water. Okay, we poured out water into the cup. Okay, we're headed to the head waiter. But something happens in the middle of steps of faith. It's not so subtle of a display of the character of the kingdom. The values of the kingdom are upside down as compared to the culture of the world. Notice who's going to see the miracle first. The servants. The lower class. There's a point being made here. Jesus is interacting in a level that is showing the values of the kingdom. You see, we've already seen this. We see this in Matthew chapter 19, verse 24. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. There's an extravagant amount of wine that is going to be given. The abundance of Jesus, the reality that the miracle is happening in the middle of the ordinary. The servants are doing what Jesus has asked them, even though right before their eyes, maybe the miracle doesn't seem very clear. So again, as you process just when does all this happen, we don't really know, but here's the question that I want you to ponder as you reflect very simply on verse 8. He said to them, now draw some out and take it to the head waiter. And they did. See, here's what gives me the clue, verse 9. When the head waiter tasted the water after it had been turned into wine. Again, I don't know exactly the timing of this. But as you start to process this, I want you to ask yourself this question. How many steps are you willing to take before you see the water turn into wine? I want you to think about that. And if you take humanity and culture and Jesus followers as a whole, you see some, if you put yourself in the servant's shoes, may have said, this is ridiculous. This is just a glass of water. Why am I going to embarrass myself by giving a glass of water to the head waiter who's supposed to think that this is the next round of wine? I'm out. I'm not doing this. How many steps are you willing to take to watch the fullness of the miraculous of Jesus' presence and how he transforms your life? You see, this is significant. The Old Testament has already given a symbolic reality of who Jesus is, of what is to come, that heaven will open. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 12, they will come and shout for joy on the heights of Zion. They will be radiant with joy because of the Lord's goodness, because of the grain, the new wine, the fresh oil, and because of the young of the flocks and herds. Their life will be like an irrigated garden, and they will no longer grow weak from hunger. Joel chapter 3, verse 18, in that day, the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the streams of Judah will flow with water, and a spring will issue from the Lord's house, watering the valley of Acacias. Amos chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. Look, the days are coming. This is the Lord's declaration. When the plowman will overtake the reaper, and the one who treads grapes the sower of seed. The mountains will drip with sweet wine, and all the hills will flow with it. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild and occupy ruined cities. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine, make gardens and eat their produce. This is worth repeating. This is the moment of us understanding who is Jesus, of which John has been setting up from the very beginning of his story. The long-awaited kingdom of God has arrived. The fulfillment of abundant blessing is right here at the starting line, beginning to be fulfilled. Later we read Jesus say, I come that you might have life and have it abundantly. And from the very first moment, Jesus is showing his abundance. Jesus is showing verse 51 of chapter 1 in action. Heaven is open. We're now at verses 11 through 12. As you read through this, the head waiter tastes the water that had become wine. He didn't know where it came from. Again, notice the person who has a lot to do with wine doesn't know what's up. There's an image there. The people who should know what's going on in the kingdom of heaven, the rulers of Jerusalem, don't know what's up. Jesus is showing himself to be the one sent from God that will bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And then we get through the cultural nuance that this is what happens. Usually they start with the cheap, the expensive, and then they get to the cheap because people don't know the difference and they don't know the taste. But this wine is like top shelf wine. And so you see what's happening here. And then verse 11, Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee. This is what Jesus did. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Here's the point in verses 11 and 12. After this, he went down to Capernaum together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there only a few days. This is the first of 7 signs that John will record. This is leading readers to faith in Jesus. Notice it starts with Mary's faith and it ends with the bolstering of the disciples' faith. The point of this story is you're being led to faith in Jesus. And Jesus is going to reveal something in not only this first sign, but in all the signs that will follow this sign. And what Jesus is revealing is, number one, his ability. Jesus can, and he does, and he wants to. His ability. But also his grace in abundance and quality. This is fundamentally true of Jesus. Not only is he able, but as he engages with abundance and quality. This is who Jesus is. Again, remember, kingdom values seem upside down. Faith sees glory hidden in the shame. This family is about to experience unbelievable amounts of shame. And Jesus intervenes. Faith sees glory hidden in the shame. The Word, as John has described in chapter 1, has opened the heavens. And the Word is going to take steps in weakness, according to the culture of the world, in the flesh, and is going to die a cruel death in his final hour. And all of that is not going to heap shame on Jesus. All of that is going to reveal his glory. Only Jesus is able, and only Jesus is abundant. I want you to notice this. As we get to verse 12, belief can happen in an instant, and sometimes belief happens over a period of time. It can happen in an instant, and sometimes it takes a good amount of time. There were many servants. Some probably believed that something was going on with Jesus, as how many steps they took, they saw the water turn into wine. And some probably immediately believed. We already know from chapter 1 that the disciples that are with Jesus, Andrew and Philip and Nathanael and Simon Peter and John himself, they have followed Jesus. They have abided with Jesus. They have stayed with Jesus. They haven't been with him very long, and so their faith has been somewhat immediate, even though more about who Jesus is going to be revealed to them. But notice who's with Jesus' mother. Verse 12. Jesus' brothers. Now, Jesus' brothers are with Mary because they're with mom. They're part of the family. But what do we know about Jesus' brothers? Well, we have to fast forward a bit. John chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. After this, Jesus traveled in Galilee, since he did not want to travel in Judea because the Jews were trying to kill him. Notice the difference? Galilee, Judea. The Jewish festival of shelters was near, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples can see your works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he's seeking public recognition. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." Verse 5, for not even his brothers believed in him. Remember John the Baptist in chapter 1 says, "I didn't know him." But then the Spirit descended on him. And even in this moment, Jesus' brothers do not know the fullness of the impact of who Jesus is. Later they will. But now they don't. And in fact, it takes a long time for them to understand the fullness of who Jesus is. I want you to ponder that truth. Belief can happen in an instant, and sometimes it happens over a period of time. And so for you, this is the space I want you to question and reflect. What does it mean for you to take seriously the words of Mary? Do whatever he tells you. Do whatever Jesus tells you. Now, we have the privilege of knowing a lot of what Jesus has instructed his followers through the power of the Word of God. But do you believe? And are your decisions a representation that Jesus is the only source for genuine transformation? You see, Mary knew what she knew, and she didn't know what she didn't know. But even in this moment, Mary started to understand what it meant not just to be Jesus' mother, but to be a disciple. Do whatever he tells you. How many steps do you need to take in order to see the water turned into wine? Where are you in the space? This is all the reflection questions. Where are you in the space of the values of the kingdom are upside down? We live in a place of which the flesh, the world, and the enemy will do whatever it is to destroy the advancement of the good news of Jesus. What does it mean for you to not participate in the values of the world or the flesh or the enemy, but to participate in the values of the kingdom? To ponder the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does it mean to know deep down what Jesus has instructed his followers to do? What does it mean for Jesus to influence your thoughts? Jesus to influence your actions? Jesus to be the light in a very, very dark world? I want us to spend some time in prayer. And I would invite you to pray over a couple of different things. The question of reflection for this morning, definitely be praying through that. But I also want you to be praying about the distinction between light and dark. I want you to ask yourself the question, even in the context of this church, in the context of the relationships that you have here, in the context of our place in the city of Tucson, our place in the United States, our place in the globe, what does it mean for us to be light? What does it mean for us to do what Jesus has asked us to do? Are we willing to call out darkness? Are we willing to not participate in darkness? Are we willing to be people who take steps of faith continually in the direction of light? Those are the spaces that I want you to be thinking through and praying through and starting now. So spend some time, the next 2 or 3 minutes in prayer, asking Jesus to reveal to you how you can continue to be a person of light, that he would bolster your faith. Ask Jesus to reveal to you, are you willing, are you demonstrating that you do whatever Jesus asks? Ask Jesus to help you continue to join him in overcoming darkness. Spend some time in prayer, and then we'll move right into our continued time of musical worship.